3 feet. That's all it took to cost my neighbor $40,000. Not 3 feet of concrete, not 3 feet of a house foundation, 3 feet of my backyard. The funny thing is, if he just asked me for permission, we probably would have had a completely different story. Instead, he spent 3 summers quietly moving my fence, one little shove at a time, and by the time he was done, the county ended up making him tear apart the nicest deck in our neighborhood. My name is Ethan Walker, and this happened in a quiet subdivision outside Cedar Ridge, Ohio, a place where most people wave when they drive by, mow their lawns on Saturday mornings, and generally stay out of each other's business. I bought my house almost 12 years ago after my divorce. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't big, but it was mine. After spending years rebuilding my life, that little property represented something bigger than land. It represented stability. Every tree I'd planted, every flower bed I'd built, every repair I'd made with my own hands carried a piece of my story. The backyard especially meant a lot to me. It wasn't huge, maybe a quarter-acre total, but it backed up to a small wooded area. In the evenings, I'd sit out there with a cup of coffee and watch deer wander through the tree line. The fence along my eastern property line wasn't beautiful by magazine standards. It was just a solid 6-foot pine fence I built myself during my first year in the house. I still remember hauling bags of concrete in the back of my old pickup and digging post holes all weekend long. Every post sat exactly where a licensed surveyor had marked the property boundary when I purchased the place. I kept copies of every survey, every permit, every receipt in a filing cabinet inside my office. Not because I expected trouble, but because my father always used to say, "Paperwork seems useless until the day it saves you." At the time, I thought he was paranoid. Years later, I realized he was a genius. For almost a decade, nothing unusual happened. Then Caleb Morrison moved in next door. The first year, Caleb seemed friendly enough. He was successful, drove a brand new truck every other year, always had contractors coming and going, and liked talking about his next home improvement project. The kind of guy who could turn a simple conversation about weather into a presentation about how much money he'd spent upgrading something. At first, I didn't mind him. Actually, I kind of admired his energy. But over time, I started noticing little things. Caleb didn't really see property lines the way most people did. He saw them more like suggestions. If a delivery truck blocked someone else's driveway, he shrugged. If construction materials spilled onto a neighbor's lawn, he called it temporary inconvenience. Rules always seemed negotiable when they got in the way of what he wanted. The first real sign of trouble came when he started talking about building a deck. Not a normal deck, a massive one. Every conversation somehow returned to the deck. "Wait till you see this thing, Ethan," he'd say. "It's going to add serious value to the house." One afternoon, he actually pulled out architectural drawings while we were standing in our driveways. The deck wrapped around the back of his house, included built-in lighting, a pergola, an outdoor kitchen, and enough seating for half the neighborhood. I remember looking at the plans and noticing how close everything appeared to our shared property line. "Looks pretty tight over there," I said casually. Caleb laughed. "I've got plenty of room." Maybe I should have paid more attention to that answer. Construction started the following spring. For weeks, crews worked from sunrise to sunset. Trucks arrived carrying composite boards, steel brackets, lighting fixtures, and stacks of lumber. The project looked expensive because it was expensive. Every day, the structure grew larger. Every day, it crept closer to my fence. Still, I assumed permits had been approved. Inspectors came by several times. Vehicles with county logos appeared and disappeared. Everything looked official. Eventually, the deck was finished, and I have to admit, it looked impressive. It was the kind of backyard feature people stopped to admire. Neighbors complimented it. Friends came over for barbecues. Caleb loved the attention. Then, one summer evening, about a year later, I noticed something strange. I was mowing the grass when I glanced toward the fence and felt that odd sensation you get when something looks wrong, but you can't immediately explain why. After finishing the yard, I grabbed a tape measure. Near my driveway sat an old concrete survey marker that had been there since before I bought the house. I'd measured from it countless times during landscaping projects. The distance to my fence was different. Not dramatically different. About a foot. maybe a little more. I stared at the measurement for several minutes. Then I measured again. Same result. I remember laughing to myself because the alternative seemed ridiculous. Fences don't move. They especially don't move by themselves. I considered walking next door and asking Caleb about it, but something stopped me. Instead, I took photographs from several angles, wrote down the date, saved everything in a folder on my computer, and went on with my life. Looking back now, that decision may have been the smartest thing I did during the entire ordeal. Because at that point, I still wasn't sure whether I had a problem or whether I was about to discover one. The next few months passed without much excitement, and eventually that strange measurement drifted into the back of my mind. Life has a way of doing that. Work got busy. My daughter started planning her wedding. I spent more time traveling than I wanted to. The fence became one of those little mysteries you file away and forget about. Then the following summer happened. I came home from a 2-week business trip in late May. The first thing I noticed was how much larger Caleb's deck seemed from my kitchen window. At first, I thought it was an illusion. Maybe the landscaping had changed. Maybe he'd removed some shrubs. But when I walked outside, that same uncomfortable feeling returned. The fence looked wrong again. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed the same tape measure, walked over to the concrete marker, and checked the distance. My stomach dropped. The fence had moved again. Another 1.5 feet, give or take. Now we're not talking about imagination anymore. We're talking about a pattern. I stood there staring at the numbers, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. Kids playing a prank? Impossible. Storm damage? There hadn't been any major storms. Construction mistake? Maybe once. Not twice. I walked the entire length of the fence line and began noticing details I hadn't paid attention to before. Fresh soil around several posts. Slightly different concrete coloration near the bases. Tiny clues that suggested the fence hadn't simply shifted. Somebody had physically relocated sections of it. That evening, I sat on my patio watching Caleb host one of his usual backyard gatherings. Music played. People laughed. String lights glowed beneath the pergola. The deck looked beautiful. It also looked suspiciously comfortable sitting in the exact area where my yard used to be. For the first time, a thought entered my head that I couldn't ignore. What if this wasn't an accident? What if somebody had figured out that moving a fence a little bit every year attracts less attention than building something directly across a property line? The idea sounded crazy. Then again, so did a fence migrating across a backyard. The next morning, Caleb happened to be outside, washing his truck. He walked over. "Hey, Caleb," I said casually. "Quick question. Have you done any work near the fence recently?" He looked up for half a second. "Not really." "What? Just seems like it's shifted a little." He laughed immediately. Too quickly. Wood fences settle. Happens all the time. Then he returned to spraying his truck as if the conversation was over. Most people would probably let that answer go. I didn't. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. There was something rehearsed about it. Something that felt prepared. That conversation bothered me for weeks. Every time I looked out the window, I noticed the deck. Every time I noticed the deck, I thought about the fence. Every time I thought about the fence, I thought about Caleb's smile. You know the kind. The smile people wear when they think they're smarter than everyone around them. Then came summer number 3. The summer, everything finally snapped into focus. I had spent a weekend helping my brother renovate his garage. When I returned home Sunday evening, I walked into my backyard carrying a cooler and nearly stopped in my tracks. The fence was farther west again. Not inches. Not enough to debate. Noticeably farther. At that point, nearly 3 feet of my property had disappeared compared to the original survey measurements. 3 feet may not sound like much until you actually stand there and see it. Suddenly, the distance between the fence and my garden beds looked wrong. The spacing near the trees looked wrong. Years of visual memory were screaming that something had changed. And now Caleb's deck extended comfortably into the space where my fence originally stood. I didn't sleep much that night. Part of me wanted to march next door and start yelling. Another part of me wanted to call an attorney immediately. But the older I get, the more I've learned that anger rarely produces the best decisions. Evidence does. So instead of confronting him, I started preparing. Quietly, methodically, patiently. Early the following spring, before construction season really started, I hired a licensed surveyor named Marcus Reed. Marcus had been surveying land for nearly 30 years and had the calm confidence of someone who trusted measurements more than opinions. We walked the property together one chilly morning while he reviewed the original plat maps. "You kept all your records?" he asked. "Every single one." He smiled. "Good. Makes my job easier." For the next several hours, his crew worked across both properties, locating old iron pins, verifying coordinates, and documenting every marker. They used equipment that looked like something from a NASA launch site. Lasers, GPS receivers, digital mapping tools. Watching them work made me realize how ridiculous property disputes can be. People argue endlessly about feelings while mathematics quietly keeps score. Around lunchtime, Marcus approached me holding a clipboard. "You're going to want to see this." We walked toward the eastern boundary. He pointed to several markers and then to the edge of Caleb's deck. "Your fence wasn't the issue." "What do you mean?" Marcus studied the measurements again. "The deck crosses the property line." I felt my chest tighten. "How far?" He paused. "4 feet, 3 inches. I honestly thought I had misheard him. 4 feet and 3 inches. We stood there in silence. Suddenly, every strange detail from the previous 3 years clicked into place. The fence wasn't being moved because it was in the way. It was being moved because the deck had already been built across the boundary. Moving the fence made the encroachment appear smaller. Maybe small enough that nobody would question it. Maybe small enough that over time people would simply accept the new reality. Marcus continued explaining the technical details, but my mind was racing. 4 feet 3 inches wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a measurement error. It wasn't somebody misreading a tape measure. It was a substantial portion of a major structure sitting on land Caleb didn't own. Before leaving, Marcus provided a preliminary report and promised the sealed final survey within days. When the official package arrived, it was thorough. Coordinates, photographs, pinlocatino, property descriptions, everything documented with professional precision. I spent an entire evening reviewing every page. Then I opened my filing cabinet and pulled out all the photographs I'd taken over the previous 3 summers. Suddenly, those images became something more than curiosity. They became evidence. They showed a progression, a timeline, a story. 1 foot, then another 1.5 feet, then another shift, piece by piece, year after year. The next Wednesday morning, I drove downtown and walked into the county building department carrying a folder thick enough to qualify as a textbook. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't emotional. I was simply presenting facts. The woman behind the counter accepted the survey, reviewed the complaint paperwork, and asked a few routine questions. "You're alleging encroachment?" she asked. "I'm submitting a survey that documents encroachment," I replied. "Big difference." Within days, county officials pulled Caleb's original permit file. Inspectors reviewed the approved plans. Surveyors compared measurements. Building officials began asking questions. Questions that apparently didn't have very good answers. And for the first time in 3 years, I had a feeling the fence wasn't going to be moving anymore. For about a week and a half, nothing seemed to happen. At least, nothing visible. The neighborhood carried on like it always did. People walked their dogs. Lawns got mowed. Kids rode bicycles down the sidewalks. Caleb still hosted friends on weekends, still sat beneath the pergola on his giant deck, still acted like everything was perfectly normal. But underneath that calm surface, the county was digging through paperwork, comparing surveys, reviewing permit records, and connecting dots that had taken me 3 years to notice. 11 days after I filed the complaint, I came home from work and spotted a county vehicle parked in front of Caleb's house. 2 inspectors were standing on the deck with clipboards while Caleb followed them around, looking increasingly uncomfortable. I didn't walk over. I didn't need to. From my kitchen window, I could practically read the story unfolding across the property line. The following morning, an official notice appeared taped beside Caleb's front door. By that afternoon, the entire neighborhood knew something serious had happened. One neighbor texted me, asking if I had heard about a permit issue. Another claimed the deck might need modifications. Nobody knew the full story yet. I did. 3 days later, Caleb finally came to my door. It was the first real conversation we'd had in months. I opened the door and immediately saw the anger in his face. Not the explosive kind, the dangerous kind, the kind that simmers. You filed that complaint. It wasn't a question. I submitted a survey, I replied. He stared at me for several seconds. You could have talked to me first. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because of the sheer irony. 3 summers. 3 years of fence movements. 3 years of opportunities to talk. I did ask about the fence. His jaw tightened. You're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be. The county seems to disagree. That answer landed exactly the way I expected. He shook his head and muttered something under his breath before turning around and walking away. That was the last real conversation we ever had. A week later, the final determination arrived. The county concluded that a substantial portion of the deck had been constructed beyond the legal property boundary. Because the structure was built and permitted using inaccurate measurements, compliance could not be achieved with a simple correction. The encroaching sections had to be removed. In practical terms, that meant dismantling most of the deck. I later learned the original project cost somewhere around $40,000, maybe more. Composite materials, lighting systems, custom framing, gas line installation, pergola construction, electrical work, all of it tied together into a design that couldn't simply be trimmed back a few inches. The entire thing had to come apart. The first demolition crew arrived on a cloudy Monday morning. I'll be honest with you. Watching it happen felt strange. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt uncomfortable. Nobody enjoys seeing that much money evaporate. At least nobody should. But every time sympathy started creeping in, I'd remember those fence posts. I'd remember the photographs. I'd remember standing in my backyard wondering whether I was losing my mind because measurements I trusted for years suddenly made no sense. Piece by piece, the deck disappeared. Railings came down first, then sections of flooring, then support structures. Workers hauled away stacks of composite boards that still looked brand new. The pergola vanished. Lighting fixtures disappeared. Portions of the outdoor kitchen were dismantled. Day after day, truckloads of material left the property. Neighbors slowed their cars when passing by. Some pretended not to stare. Others didn't bother pretending. The whole thing became a neighborhood spectacle. One afternoon, I was planting flowers near my patio when an older neighbor named Frank wandered over. He watched the demolition crew for a moment before shaking his head. That's an expensive lesson. Looks that way. Frank glanced toward me. Think he knew? I considered the question carefully. The truth is, I still don't know with absolute certainty what Caleb knew or when he knew it. Maybe he intentionally moved the fence. Maybe a contractor suggested it. Maybe everyone involved convinced themselves that nobody would ever check. What I do know is that fences don't relocate themselves across property lines 3 summers in a row. Frank chuckled softly. People get funny when they start thinking they deserve a little more than everybody else. I thought about that conversation for a long time, because in many ways, this story was never really about land. It was about entitlement. It was about the belief that small violations don't matter if they're gradual enough. 1 foot today, another foot tomorrow. A little compromise here, a little shortcut there. Eventually, those small decisions become a very large problem. By late fall, the demolition was complete. The rebuilt deck ended exactly where the property line required it to end. New inspections were performed. New approvals were issued. Everything was finally legal. As for the fence, it returned to its original location according to the survey markers that had been there all along. Looking at it now, you'd never know how much drama surrounded those boards. You just see an ordinary fence sitting in an ordinary backyard. Funny how ordinary things sometimes carry extraordinary stories. Caleb never apologized. He never acknowledged what happened. In fact, he barely spoke to me again. If we happened to be outside at the same time, he'd look the other direction. Some people might consider that an unfortunate ending. Personally, I considered it a bonus feature. Peace and quiet is worth a lot these days. Every once in a while, somebody asks whether I feel guilty about what happened. The answer usually surprises them. No, I don't. I didn't build the deck. I didn't move the fence. I didn't falsify measurements. All I did was verify where the property line actually existed. The consequences came from choices that were already made long before I hired a surveyor. But here's the part that still sparks arguments whenever I tell this story. If Caleb had knocked on my door at the very beginning and said, "Hey, Ethan, I want to expand my deck. Would you be willing to discuss some options?" There's a decent chance we could have worked something out. Maybe not 4 feet, maybe not permanently, but neighbors solve problems together all the time. Instead, somebody decided it was easier to quietly move reality than to ask permission. And that's what ultimately cost $40,000. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered a neighbor had slowly taken 3 feet of your property over several years, would you have handled it the same way? Would you have confronted them immediately, gone straight to court, or let it go to keep the peace? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always divide people right down the middle. And if you've ever dealt with difficult neighbors, property disputes, HOA drama, or someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them, make sure to subscribe, because sometimes the biggest battles don't happen in courtrooms. They happen right across the fence.